We simply do not get games like Viewtiful Joe anymore. Focused, dense, experimental, both high production values and rock-solid fundamentals. And even if we get games like this, such as Hyper Demon, these types of games normally bubble up from the indie space rather than coming from major publishers like Capcom, because in today's remake-soaked gaming culture, taking a risk on some new theoretical game franchise seems insane. And it is insane with today's elevated production costs and players' ever-expanding appetite for mass scale and narrative experience. We are content hungry, and volume is what we value. We want a steaming pile of new experiences, even if the new experiences are poorly developed and shallow, which makes a condensed and balanced action game like Viewtiful Joe impossible, even conceptually. Even if Capcom decided to make Viewtiful Joe in 2025, it could not survive in its original form, where the core basis of the game's value comes from mechanical design and replayability based off of performance. These days, a game like Viewtiful Joe would have much more padding to appear as a full game, even if that padding is actively boring and diminishes the overall pace and impact of the experience. Look at Bayonetta 3. It's fascinating to see the contrast between the early days of Clover and the later days of Platinum, and how much Platinum have diffused their game design with action RPG elements compared to the clear arcade roots of the Clover developers. Viewtiful Joe is a beat-em-up after all. And speaking of Clover, the story of Clover Studio is a fascinating one because in the short-term perspective, which is how games are analyzed now, the studio was a complete failure. The entire purpose of Clover was for Capcom to take their heavy-hitter developers like Mikami and Kamiya and have them develop new creative IPs to build Capcom's artistic legacy, which they did end up doing with the creation of God Hand, Okami, and Viewtiful Joe, but only in a long-term sense. Decades later, we look back at these games with fondness and appreciation, but at the time of their creation, they were not very well understood, at least not God Hand, or even if they were appreciated by critics like Viewtiful Joe and Okami, they didn't sell that well, and Capcom were not getting their return on investment. And what's painfully ironic about Viewtiful Joe in particular is that of the three properties Clover created, I think Joe, despite being so universally appreciated, will always struggle the most to reach a large audience because of its underlying hardcore structure. God Hand is hardcore as well, but it's easy to see how God Hand could adapt to appeal to the enormous Souls audience, so there's a lot of potential overlap there. Whereas with Viewtiful Joe, what audience could this game feasibly target other than the diminishing character action and beat-em-up players? Especially being a 2D game, it would also have to compete with the armada of 2D indie platformers like Hollow Knight and other Metroidvanias that are starting to have their own impressive production values, so it wouldn't even have an edge in that department. Again, just look at how well Bayo 3 performed, despite its lavish critical praise. It did all right, but it didn't set the sales records on fire or anything like that. And this is why I think it makes complete sense that the later Viewtiful Joe games were created for the DS and PSP handhelds, with their focus on immediate replayable game design and with their limitations on scale and production values. Handhelds seem like the perfect environment for the series, very much like how Castlevania was protected by the Nintendo DS, which I discussed in a previous video. Unfortunately, because of the Nintendo and Steam Deck and these tablet-style handhelds, the traditional handheld market just doesn't exist in the same way anymore. And so, as I understand, Kamiya has actually left Platinum and returned to working with Capcom and has pitched the ideas of making Okami 2 and Viewtiful Joe 3. And if the news I am reading is accurate, it seems like Okami 2 is getting the green light, but there is no word on Viewtiful Joe 3. This makes a lot of sense to me, sadly, because I could easily see how Okami 2 could tap into the Zelda Breath of the Wild style audience, and I bet Capcom are just salivating at the idea of having their own big Zelda style game, whereas Viewtiful Joe, what could they really do with it? There's not a clear target demographic because of how experimental and hardcore it is. And so in today's review, I'd like to discuss not only my love and appreciation for Viewtiful Joe's experimental design, but more importantly, to discuss how it pulls off this experimental design while still keeping the structure and core mechanics intact, which I think is a real strength of this game that seems to diminish somewhat as time with Platinum goes on.
Make sure you flush the toilet.
The signature feature of Viewtiful Joe is, of course, the slow-mo mechanic. This was really in vogue during the early 2000s, probably because of the popularity of The Matrix. I'm assuming developers were really intrigued with this idea of using time in their action game combat systems. And so during this era, you've got Max Payne with slow-mo, you've got Dead to Rights, you've got The Prince of Persia, and of course, Viewtiful Joe as well. And of all the games during this era, I think Viewtiful Joe's time-based mechanics hold up the best because they're the most holistic and versatile. Clover really knew what they were doing. They were seasoned veterans, of course, from Capcom, and they had a real eye for small but very important details with these types of systems that made them function in a lot more of an organic sort of way, I guess you could say, where it's not prescribed. And that was my big fear with Viewtiful Joe. It's been years since I played it, and I was like, oh boy, are we going to get into one of these scenarios that I've seen with a lot of games where they bring in this kind of flashy mechanic, slow down, and then what ends up happening is that mechanic just overpowers the core design of the game, and you end up in these rote, prescribed situations of, it's time to use slow-mo, time to use the slow-mo. You see this a lot with action game design now. Viewtiful Joe's slow motion mechanic isn't like this because they made a lot of really important overall choices with it. First of all, you're not just slowing down the game. That's not the only thing that's happening. When you're in slow motion, you're actually in a distinct state. You're in a distinct move set where your attacks are different and they have different properties. So with your basic attacks, when you're in slow-mo, they will break armor and they'll also launch enemies. And the launching is really important because it brings in this risk reward with the spacing of the game. Because let's say you've got a bunch of enemies surrounding you, you go into slow-mo, you punch one guy to the left, you punch one guy to the right. You've launched them in two different directions and you've broken up their grouping. You want to keep them grouped together. And so having the slow-mo be tied to launching the enemy prevents you from just spamming it all the time because you need to be prepared to where they will end up. And then also the fact that it launches the enemies and you can't quite keep up with them when you're slow motion is also really important because that brings in the spacing element and the wall elements of this game. Walls are big in Clover games. It's like a signature thing. At least with God Hand, walls were really big. Same thing with Viewtiful Joe, and I think that's great, especially being a 2D game. There's only so much you can do with level design, and so having the walls be an aspect to the combat system, I think is fantastic. And you'll see that that's the primary way you score and get combos. And when you get into a room and it's got really close walls and a bunch of little enemies, you're like, jackpot, it's time to rack up some serious score. Another small but important detail with the pace of the game is that without the slow motion system, the game's pace is slightly faster than you would normally get in an action game. You notice that the enemy attacks, besides the basic ones, especially at the higher difficulty levels, are almost kind of unreactable. They're not, but they're kind of closer to that edge of unreactable than you would typically get in a commercial action game. And I don't think it's a coincidence that when you run out of meter and you run out of slowdown, you revert to a state where you're naked, because that's how you feel when you don't have at least a little bit of slowdown meter in order to deal with some of these nearly unreactable attacks. And so I think that's a great little dimension of visual design there to be like, yeah, you are kind of naked. And that comes down to the game's pace. It's so fast and it's so dense that without these slowdown mechanics, it feels a little overwhelming. And I think that's the best use of slowdown in a game. You don't want to take a game that's already slow and then slow it more. You want to take a game that's a little bit overly fast naturally, and then you add in that slow motion mechanic as a tool for the player to give themselves a little bit of breathing space and to cope with the situation. And Viewtiful Joe is well tuned in that regard. It has fantastic pace. And so that was something that I was very relieved to see. And then speaking of fantastic pace, it was a stroke of inspiration of Kamiya to introduce the other half of time, which is fast forward. So not only are you manipulating time to slow it down, you're manipulating it to speed it up. And when you first get introduced the speed up mechanic, I know that I was a little bit overwhelmed. I mean, Viewtiful Joe has a lot of stuff going on. You have the high and low of the natural combat system, then you've got the slow motion, the launchers, and then you have fast forward thrown at you. What do I do here? There's a lot going on. And a lesser game would help the player by just siloing off all of these mechanics into discrete functions and then telling you when to use them. So it'd be like, oh, here's the guy, use slow motion on the guy. Oh, here's this other guy, now you use fast forward. And oh, here's the section where you use fast forward. Here's the section where you use slow-mo. And you get bits of that throughout the game. But what I love about the time mechanics of Viewtiful Joe is they're a lot more ambiguous and open-ended, and they're used in multiple ways. Just look at the difference between a player who's playing for top ranks and playing for score and a player that's playing for speed and doing speed runs. The speed runs of this game look insane, by the way. Normally, I don't think speed runs of beat 'em ups look awesome, but Viewtiful Joe is definitely an exception because of the speed up mechanic mostly. And that's what I'm getting at, where it creates an amazing sense of pace that goes well beyond just the combat system. It goes into the game experience overall, because using the fast forward, you're able to eliminate a lot of rote sequences, and it creates a really dense experience. This is something I've talked about on the channel here and there. I thought I'd bring it up again. It's been a while. Gameplay density. Someone made this cool graphic visually depicting the concept, so shout outs to them. And yes, gameplay density is the moment-to-moment meaningful decision-making and input interaction, meaning feedback, that a game has the player embark on. So something like Stellar Blade, low gameplay density where you spend a lot of time just wandering around, waiting for things to happen. Platinum struggles with this a lot because of their misguided views on perceived intensity. There's this talk where they say they deliberately add in these sections where nothing happens so that you perceive the intensity of the section coming up as being higher. I don't agree with this view set in any way. And look at Viewtiful Joe. Viewtiful Joe is insanely intense. I have not heard anyone say otherwise. In fact, I've heard people say it's almost like too intense for them. So yeah, this whole downtime for perceived intensity thing, I don't agree with it. And what's great about Viewtiful Joe is if there's ever sections where there is a time where you need to wait for things to happen, you just fast forward through it. And so it creates this amazing in-game option that you only really get in emulators because they have fast forward to opt out of pretty much all downtime. You can cruise through Viewtiful Joe, but in order to cruise through it, you need to master it. That's the thing about it that I really like. It's not that you're just fast forwarding through all this fluff that would ultimately be meaningless. In order to earn the fast forward, you need to know what is going to happen, and you need to be able to take that risk and respond to it. And so as you learn the game literally gets faster. That is something that's very cool, and I can't think of many other games that do it, but it's a very engaging gameplay dynamic that I was really getting into, and it makes the game incredibly addictive, especially since Viewtiful Joe is so time conscious. This game is all about time, not only with the mechanics of slowing it down and speeding it up, but just the overall scoring system, the enemy design, the boss design. This game is one of the best games at using time. And that brings us to Viewtiful Joe's level design and scoring system. And normally when I do reviews of action games, I hardly ever discuss their scoring systems in detail unless they're a shmup. Not because I don't think scoring systems are important, they are incredibly important, but because most action games, if they even have scoring systems, are just afterthoughts. They're meaningless. Look at God Hand. As much as I love that game, its scoring system does not function. But in the case of Viewtiful Joe, I am shocked but happy to report that it is the best beat-em-up scoring system I have ever encountered. And there's a lot of little details as to why that is, but the main reason why is the way it segments into the level design, the way it communicates with the player constantly, and the way it pushes the player on time versus enemy interaction. You have to achieve both of these goals, but they heavily oppose one another. You need to get to the end quickly, but you also need to fight the enemies, which takes time to get the combat rating. And so there's a lot of depth in decision making with the routing of each section because you need to get to the end. Hurry! You don't have time to waste, but you also need to fight the enemies, and not just fight them. You need to group them up, and you need to get them in a counter state, and then you need to juggle them and combo them, and that takes time to set up. But the more time you take setting that up, the more you're going to lose that time completion. Perfect. And one really unique feature of the enemy design of Viewtiful Joe is that rather than having the enemies punish the player by getting aggressive and constantly attacking you, because it wants to play into this time-chasing aspect of the scoring system, instead a lot of the enemies punish the player by being obnoxious and running away and playing keep out, which forces you to go on the offensive, kind of like playing against a zoner in a fighting game. And so that is one really cool little detail that the enemy design of this game has that I think stands out a lot, is how much the game forces you to chase the enemies and the bosses and makes you feel like an idiot if they escape your grasp.
I'll get you for this! You won't escape my wrath!
And what's really clever, and I don't know exactly why Viewtiful Joe does it this way, other than probably to make it a little bit more digestible, is that rather than doing this in a whole stage format, which most action games do, instead Viewtiful Joe breaks it down into discrete sections of levels that chain into one another to create these dedicated segments. This is important for two reasons. The first reason is because they make the expectation of the player a lot more clear and manageable, because if they had the entire stage be evaluated, it would be pretty ambiguous at times what you were supposed to be doing and when, where are you improving, how long certain encounters are supposed to take. But by breaking them into these small digestible pieces, you know as the player, oh, in this encounter, it's supposed to take this long and I'm supposed to get this many points. So I really like the clarity and communication of this segmented style. And the second part of this segmented style that I really like is how present it always is. Because the game is constantly shoving the scoring system in your face, you can't help but pay attention to it. It's easy to ignore scores and numbers and tallies when they're at the end of the stage and you're kind of checked out and you're thinking about something else and you're thinking about what's coming. That's easy to ignore. But when it's constantly popping up in middle of your run, in middle of this stage, reminding you, you were slow there. Oh, you're not getting good scores there. You took a hit. It makes you feel guilty when you underperform. My playthrough of this game took forever and a lot of time and practice because it kept making me feel bad for not getting high ranks. And that is good design. That's not bad design. That's good design. If you're making the player feel guilty for performing poorly with your scoring system, that is some real magic and something that a lot of scoring genres like shmups really struggle with, because it's so easy to just take that score and hide it away somewhere or make it feel arbitrary or pointless. So the fact that Viewtiful Joe is so effective at getting you as a player to engage with its scoring system and rank and all that is really unique. And something else about the scoring and ranking system that I wanted to point out that I think is improved over later Platinum games like Bayonetta is that you can see a lot of DNA between Bayonetta and Viewtiful Joe. And that is one important thing about games like Viewtiful Joe, is that they explore and develop a lot of concepts that end up becoming much more mainstream, like Witch Time. You can see the exact line from Viewtiful Joe's dodging into slow-mo attack and Witch Time dodging into slow-mo attack. So that is one important thing about these types of games, is they set up a lot of ideas and mechanics that can pay off in more mainstream popular games later on. And look how Witch Time has become such a well-known mechanic even outside of Bayonetta. But one thing that I think Viewtiful Joe does better than Bayonetta is the way it does its ranks, because first of all, Bayonetta has this exploit where you can just restart checkpoints and reset the ranks until you get a Platinum, so there's that problem Viewtiful Joe doesn't have. But another thing that I think Viewtiful Joe does better than Bayonetta is that the ranking is more holistic to the entire game experience rather than just the combat encounters, because with Viewtiful Joe, the time, the damage, and the score are not just during combat encounters, it's during the entire game. It's through the platforming, picking up items, all of that works into your rank. Whereas in Bayonetta, it's more segmented out, where it becomes two different games. You have the one overworld game where you're running around kind of Zelda style, and then you have the combat game in discrete arenas where the scoring takes place. But I like how all aspects of Viewtiful Joe, the traversal, the platforming, the combat, are all factored in together. And I think that is one reason why the platforming and traversal are a lot more tight and focused than in later Platinum games, because they are, in this case, integrated into the scoring system. So they can't have these long, obnoxious, extended sections of platforming without some combat thrown in there, without keeping the core gameplay involved. So that is something that's a finer point, but I think makes a massive difference, because all of the core systems of the game, like the enemy design, boss design, and platforming, effectively weave together, which is what gives Joe its classic feel. The enemy types are not just one-on-one encounters like we see in Pseudo Souls, which was a fear of mine because of the high and low dodge system. But in Joe, getting these high and low dodges is just the first step, and not always the correct one, by the way, because you still need to account for how to group the enemies together to punish quickly and effectively. In true beat-em-up fashion, the enemy types are designed to overlap each other and snowball in dangerous ways, especially when they start mixing in with stage hazards. When you enter a room in Viewtiful Joe, you have to plan a route that accounts for all of these variables, and you have to prioritize what targets to attack first. What's misleading about the way Joe presents itself, but in a good way, is that it seems loosey-goosey, improvisational when you first start playing, but as you get into the mechanics and further into the game design, it becomes clear how intense and routing heavy the basic gameplay elements are. You're given a lot of wiggle room to play lame to survive if you want to, but at the same time, because of the expressive ranking prompts and even through the progression system power-up point rewards, Joe does a great job of shaming you for playing lame and pushing you to play more aggressively. The next thing I'd like to talk about is this game's story, which may seem surprising because I normally don't like to discuss story in game reviews, and I am on record saying that gameplay and game design is primary and story is secondary, which I absolutely believe. And this is why I want to point out Viewtiful Joe's story, because I think it's such a strong example of what I've been talking about on the channel, where Viewtiful Joe, in terms of its story, is doing a great job of contextualizing all of these different gameplay mechanic ideas into a cool visual style. And that is something that I would say is one of the strongest aspects of story in video games, is you want to create some sort of framework to contextualize what is happening in the game gameplay-wise, and also something that creates a distinctive visual style that informs you about the gameplay design. So Viewtiful Joe, using this concept of cameras and film and movies, is really effective because now all of the weird stuff that happens in Viewtiful Joe's gameplay makes sense to the player and you buy it. It stands out and communicates quality of design. And I think this is one major advantage that Viewtiful Joe had that God Hand didn't. And I think that is one main difference between their reception, where Western game reviewers could look at Viewtiful Joe visually and understand, okay, this is the concept, this is what's going on, I kind of get it, and that's all they really need to know. Whereas God Hand, the art style, it's cool and everything, but it's kind of underdeveloped, and it doesn't visually communicate itself as much as it should. The graphics of God Hand, I think, are a little bit unfinished. And so because of that slightly unfinished visual presentation, I think reviewers looked at it and thought, Clover don't know what they're doing, this is a mess, which is wrong and unfair. But what I'm saying is that having that strong visual design at least helps prevent that to some degree. And I think Viewtiful Joe really pulls that off with its premise and visual style. And so if you were to ask me what a strong example of using story in game design looks like, I would point to Viewtiful Joe because it makes a lot of eccentric ideas make way more sense than they actually should. You got cameras zooming in for your power punch attacks, you're speeding up, you're slowing down. There's all these out there game design decisions that are kind of absurd if you stop to think about it. This is something that Viewtiful Joe is so good at doing, and one of the best examples I can think of at selling you game design decisions visually and in concept, and you buy into it. And then the last thing I want to talk about is this game's use of meter. I'm becoming increasingly skeptical of meter use in game design because these days I see it often as more of a crutch than actually a meaningful game design decision, because now with the power of meters, you can always just throw in some sort of mechanic or idea, and then you don't really have to balance it too holistically into the rest of the design because, oh, if it's a little overpowered, we'll just decrease the meter. Oh, if it's a little underpowered, we'll just increase the meter. And the problem with a lot of game design now is that a lot of mechanics and functions are just being broken out and segmented away from each other in these little compartments, and then they use meter to independently manage all the little operating systems. And so you have this fragmented modular style of game design that I think is ultimately really shallow and interchangeable, and it's also making games now really generic because everything's using meters in the same way, and it's game design via spreadsheet, which I'm not a fan of, especially when it starts to really override all of the natural mechanics of combat system. Natural mechanics being hits done, frame data, hitboxes, all of that stuff. Basically what you do when you don't have meter. Those are the natural mechanics. And so you would think I would not really dig Viewtiful Joe's design because Viewtiful Joe is heavily based around meter. This is a meter-based game. But what I like about it is it takes that premise of, okay, we're going to really bring in all of these ambitious concepts and ideas and tie them to meter, but we're going to add a lot of tension to the way that meter works, and we're going to make sure that meter is constantly pressing the player with risk and reward. And the key question is, how do you make a auto-recharging meter have risk and reward? Because why don't you just stand there and wait for it to recharge, right? And that's the problem a lot of these games run into, is there's not more risk, it's just a test of patience, because all else fails, you can just stand around and wait for your meter to recharge, right? Well, there's only one really significant way that I can think of, which Viewtiful Joe does, which is you make time matter. Like I said earlier in the review, Viewtiful Joe is a very time-conscious game, and because it's very time-conscious, that refilling meter costs you time, and you need time. Therefore, you need to manage that meter incredibly closely, and you can't waste its recharge without the time. And if you're not playing for ranks or anything, you can kind of see this issue in Viewtiful Joe. You can just wait for the meter to recharge. And if you're playing for just pure survival, that is a criticism I have of Viewtiful Joe, especially in some of the early boss fights where the boss itself isn't all that aggressive. This shifts more as you get further into the game. Like the Viewtiful Joe clone boss, he can be a real nasty piece of work in a great way. But some of the early boss fights, I think, are a little under-aggressive in this manner. But then again, like I said earlier, because the game is constantly shoving that scoring system in your face like every screen and like mocking you for not doing well, I think that is a reasonable enough incentive for most players to get them going. And of course, all action games with meters kind of have this problem anyway. But I think Viewtiful Joe does a surprisingly good job of keeping that meter feeling meaningful and feeling tied in with all of the mechanics of the game. Another aspect of the meter design that I really like is how it's a pooled meter, meaning that all of your actions are pulling from the same source. I really like that it doesn't break all of your actions into little mini meters. So you'd have your slowdown meter and your speed up meter and your zoom meter. And you could tell that would be a real temptation of a modern developer to do. But I think it's very good that all of these actions are pooled together, because then you have to juggle them in a sequence and keep that meter going. And then it also punishes you for just mindlessly running the meter out. So it does test you, hey, you need to let go of the button right before it runs out, because if you're just holding the button and doing things, you're going to get punished by going down into your naked form. Again, a little detail that I think is really important because it keeps the decision-making variable to what is happening on screen. So if you're in a certain boss fight, you're juggling between, all right, we're going to be doing the slow-mo in here, but then we're going to save amount of meter to run away with speed up, and then we need to actually leave this much meter left to charge up before the next attack. And so you're keeping the base combat and the meter combat in conversation with each other a lot, and the meter does not end up overwriting the core combat. Instead, it complements it in a very strong way. I think it is one of Kamiya's best in this regard. I think it manages a lot of this better than Bayo does oftentimes. So I was really impressed with that. And I do wonder how much of that isn't just to Kamiya, but also to the Clover Capcom team, who seem to have a very strong understanding of fundamental design, and why I'm very excited to see Kamiya return to Capcom, because I think that is where he belongs. And Mikami, I don't think he's returning to Capcom, but these guys belong at Capcom. You have Kamiya's visionary, eccentric approach, and then you marry that with the strong fundamentals of the Capcom programmers and staff and their experience, and you put those two together, and you get something like Viewtiful Joe that's both experimental and new, but also just really well made. And I do think the early Platinum titles had this as well, like Bayonetta 1. But as Platinum has gone on and they've started to drift further and further into Square Enix territory, I think an eccentric developer like Kamiya actually becomes out of place, because his strengths shine much more in a strong team, kind of reining him in and keeping him focused. And you'll see this a lot with these visionary action game developers. Itagaki without Team Ninja is really struggling. Kojima without Konami is really struggling. Mikami without Capcom isn't doing as well either. It really is that you need both together. You need the visionary up top, and then you need that strong management team and core staff keeping them kind of contained and reasonable. And I think the divorce of these creative alliances hasn't been good for anyone. Capcom without Kamiya and Mikami is just making a bunch of remakes and crap like that. Team Ninja don't know who they are anymore. They're just making Souls-like games. I mean, they're cool to some degree, but they're not Ninja Gaiden Dead or Alive cool. And then Konami, what the hell is happening with Konami? So it's just sad that this blend is really missing in AAA studios these days. Kamiya is returning to Capcom and working on Okami too. that might work out, it might not. The scale of things is much different than in the early 2000s. The environment, the audience, all of that is just a whole different undertaking. So I'm certainly interested in what he's going to do with Okami 2, but I wouldn't hold my breath yet. Let's see how this turns out. But in the end, this is why games like Viewtiful Joe, these AA sized experimental games by more established teams, are really important, because this is where a lot of the creative ideas come from. This is where a lot of concepts and developments in game design actually come from that push the medium forward. They don't often come from like the biggest game ever. They don't. They come from these AA sized games that establish an audience, that establish a style of gameplay. People go, ooh, this is really working. And then that builds and builds and builds. You see it time and time again. And did Viewtiful Joe turn into this massive franchise? No, but it did lay out a lot of fantastic ideas and concepts that ended up directly going into a much larger franchise, Bayonetta. And you can see the line between Viewtiful Joe and Bayonetta. Not to just reduce down Viewtiful Joe to a precursor to Bayonetta, because I think it is awesome in its own right, but just as a publisher, as a developer, imagine if Capcom cooled it a little bit and let the boys cook a little bit longer, and maybe they would have gotten Bayonetta under the Capcom banner rather than under Platinum. So yeah, the lesson is that these smaller scale AA games made under established teams play a very important role in game design and are often the places where we get genuine growth and innovation. But usually when you're doing something innovative, fresh, and new, that's not going to immediately catch fire. That's not going to just be the biggest game of the year and make a bunch of money. That sometimes happens, but not always. And I think developers these days need to allocate some sort of creative investment cost for projects like Viewtiful Joe, these AA mid-sized projects, with the understanding that maybe they won't make back the return on investment and all of that sort of thing, which it seemed like this was more of a thing developers were doing in the 2000s, in the 90s, but these days, And I do understand that part of that is because development costs have gotten so high, but still, part of the game is adapting to your environment. And with time, I think most quality games pay off for the developer in the long run. And if they're not paying off for the developer in terms of money, they are definitely paying off in artistic contribution to the medium generally, which I think is really important. And speaking of artistic investment, if you enjoyed this review, I beg you to check out my Mercenaries ranking video that I just posted. I know it's massive and kind of a niche subject for people, but I am extremely proud of it, and I think there's a lot of important game design, scoring system, just general game concepts that are discussed in that video, and I'm really proud of it, so check that out if you can. And also, today's video is brought to you by the patrons directly because this was the winner of the Patreon voted review. So I'm reviewing Viewtiful Joe because of the patrons. So shout out to them for not only today's video, but just making the channel happen generally. And if you want to help me out and help contribute to this channel and keep it going, I would really appreciate support on Patreon. I'm a full-time YouTuber, so it's how I eat and pay rent and do this the way I do. And yeah, I would really appreciate that. Thanks so much. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 and $8 patrons: 100, Abdullah Suwaidi, Absconditis, Accepting Panda, Anhold, AJA, AJD578, Alistair Stevenson, Alexander Pfeiffer, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Au Ally, Autonamed, Battle Mode, Bo, Ben Foster, Beto Dames, Bog Hog, Board Bismati, Borgie22, Brent Cox, Brian Lucy, Broseph Swagman, Captain Rhodes, Chase Palumbo, Chaflip, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Clairvoyant Bongwater, Clara Cliff, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Concreted, Cooksan666, Cook Some Soup, Corio, CSP 3900, Des Audio, Dan Matei, Dan Chi, Darren Griffin, Dat Guy, Dave Hansen, David Aldress, David Crespo, Didan, Demian Smirnov, Desolus, Dimension Diver, Diodamke, DJ420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Duckies, Eduardo Quinta, Edvard, Elbin Senesev, Elusive, Elias Alonso, Empty Disco, Epson Eagle, Eric Scrivener, Eric Houdini, Esteban, Explosive General Games, Fabio, Falcus, Fenich, Fiskin, Five Sides, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Game Soup, Game Boy Guru, Gelhoff, Gojira Green, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hawk, Hans Kowalski, Hausu, Heardeth, Unhearthy, HUD, Hugh Mungus, JDab, Jake Ryan, Jack Walsh, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, Jay McCarthy, J67, JLab, JBRPG, Jimmy Striggins, Jim Cons, JMD, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, John Slaylise, Joe Saka, Josh Mayer, Julian Elwood, Jurgen, K, K2, Kane Evans, Ken10082, Kill All Music, Contain, Craze the Boys, Mangoblian, Leonard McCoy, Ludwa, Alberta, Lord Harrington, Luna Lilich, LZR Cuter, Matt Combaticus, Malaise, Mario Simic, Mark Mann, Mars Bar, Master Zion, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Maz, Minung, Meister, Metal Slime Drummer, New Jam, Michael Polito, Michael McCord, Milady, Mike Mel, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Mitwid, M. Kusanagi, Morog, Monroe, Munsta Zero, Miles P, Mishkin, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Pero, Neon Dagger Games, Nervous J, Ogre Mode, Okla Kugels, Oleg Talmatsev, Patrick Baseman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Powell Perot, Peace, Pedro Isilis, Philip Plus, PLP, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, PRK, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Quilon Jaeger, R2 Sinus, Ralph Trujillo, Randoom, Raoul, Rapido, RC, Real Skeen, Brent Holtz Time, Retrojet, Retro Man, Retro Schmupper, Rip Mason, Rip the Jacker, Robert Chang, Rory Starks, Wolf015, Salmon Connections, Sam, Sanivo, Sarn, Scanline City, Seymour, Segfault, Shader Bunny, Shantech, Chazzy, Shmup Junkie, Sirapong, Social Kid, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steplable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Swoop, Synth Milk, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, Tom McCarthy, Tim French, TK Productions, Travis Arbon, Troop Good Guy, Sugumo, Turam, 2IU, Twist Please, Twilight EX, Tyler Olu, Unicoi Roots, Ursua, Ushimushi, Video Game Enjoyer, Beautiful, Vulgarity, Wabby Legs, What Is This? Your Nerdy Joe, Yosef Khalid, Zachary Patton, Zeal, and Zen Ryoku.